For nearly 40 years, a billboard stood on a stretch of highway in West Virginia. 5 children's faces, dark-haired and solemn, staring down at every car that passed. Underneath, a question nobody could ever answer. Were they kidnapped, murdered, or are they still alive? Their mother kept that sign up until the day she died. Still wearing black, still planting flowers on the spot where her house used to stand. If you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, welcome to Jaja. Please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. It's just past midnight on December 25th, 1945, in Fayetteville, West Virginia, and a woman is lying awake in bed, unable to fall back asleep. The phone downstairs rings, sharp and sudden, in a house that's otherwise gone quiet after a long Christmas Eve. She gets up, pads down through the dark, and answers it. A woman's voice on the other end asks for a name she doesn't recognize. Behind the voice, she can hear laughter, glasses clinking, like a party somewhere still going. She tells the caller they have the wrong house, hangs up, and starts back toward bed. On her way up, she notices something odd. Every light downstairs is still on. The curtains are still open. The front door is unlocked. Her oldest daughter is asleep on the living room sofa, and she assumes the rest of the kids are upstairs where they belong. So she turns off the lights, closes the curtains, locks the door, and climbs back into bed beside her husband. She's barely drifted off when she hears it. A loud, sharp bang on the roof directly above the house. Then something rolling, a slow, dragging sound, like an object settling into place on the shingles. She doesn't get up to check. It's the middle of the night, it's cold, and there's no reason yet to think anything's wrong. About half an hour later, she wakes up again. This time, it's not a sound pulling her out of sleep. It's smoke. Downstairs, her husband is already moving, already awake, already running through a house that's filling with fire. He and his wife manage to wake the children closest to them and get them out the door. 4 of them, out into the freezing Christmas morning air, safe on the lawn while the house behind them burns. But there are 5 more children upstairs, on the far side of a staircase that's now a wall of flame, and no way to reach them. The father runs back to the house. He knows exactly which windows lead to which bedrooms, knows his children are on the other side of that glass, and he needs to get up there. There's a ladder he keeps propped against the house for exactly this kind of emergency. It's gone. Not burned, just gone, nowhere to be found. He thinks of his trucks parked in the yard, thinks he can drive one up close and climb onto the cab to reach the windows. Both trucks, running fine the day before, refuse to start. He grabs for the rain barrel to at least throw water at the flames. It's frozen solid. He's standing in his own yard, screaming names into smoke, with no ladder, no working truck, and no water, while 5 of his children are somewhere on the other side of a wall of fire he cannot get through. A neighbor runs to call the fire department. No one answers. Another call from a tavern down the road. Again, nothing. Someone finally drives into town, tracks down the fire chief in person, and the department gets moving through a kind of phone tree system, one man calling the next. The station is 2.5 miles away. It takes them until 8 o'clock in the morning to arrive. By then, the house that stood on this lot the night before is a smoking pile of ash, and there is no house left to search. Here's where this stops being a tragedy and starts being something the family will spend the rest of their lives trying to explain. Because when the sun comes up and neighbors and firefighters walk the wreckage looking for what's left of 5 children, they don't find anything. No remains, not that morning, not in the days after. The fire chief tells the family the blaze must have burned hot enough to cremate the bodies completely. A state police inspector rules it faulty wiring, plain and simple, and within days, the coroner's office issues 5 death certificates listing the cause as fire or suffocation. Case closed as far as the official record is concerned. But one of the surviving children, a teenage girl who'd been asleep on that living room sofa, remembers the fire differently than the official story allows for. She watched those upstairs windows the entire time the house was burning, and she never once saw a single one of her siblings appear in the glass. And there's something else nagging at her, something she'll repeat for the rest of her life. People always say you can smell burning flesh from miles away in a fire like that. She was standing right outside the house. She says she never smelled it at all. The family whose 5 children vanished that Christmas morning were the Sodders, George and Jenny, and by then, 10 kids born over 20 years of marriage, one of them away serving in the army and not home that night. George had come from nothing. Born Giorgio Sadu in Sardinia, Italy, he'd crossed the Atlantic alone at 13 years old after the older brother, who'd traveled with him, turned around and went straight back home. He worked the Pennsylvania railroads as a boy, carrying water to laborers, and worked his way up from nothing until he owned his own trucking company, hauling coal and freight around Fayetteville. He met Jenny at her family store, married her, and together they built a life that one local magistrate would later call one of the most respected middle-class households in the whole county. George had strong opinions about almost everything: business, politics, current events, except one subject he never discussed. Whatever happened back in Italy, whatever made him leave at 13 and never look back, he kept that to himself for the rest of his life. What George didn't keep to himself was his politics, and it's that piece, his politics, that starts pulling this story somewhere much darker than a tragic accident. Because in the months leading up to that Christmas, 3 separate things happened that the family barely thought twice about at the time, and that they would spend decades replaying afterward. A stranger showed up at the house asking about hauling work, wandered around back, pointed at the 2 fuse boxes mounted on the wall, and told George, unprompted, that it was going to cause a fire someday. This despite the fact that George had just had the wiring inspected by the power company and been told it was fine. Around the same time, a life insurance salesman came by pitching a policy, and when George turned him down, the man got angry. He told George his house was going to go up in smoke, that his children would be destroyed, and that he'd be made to pay for the things he'd been saying about Mussolini. George Sauter, it turns out, was loud and public about hating Benito Mussolini, and Fayetteville had a real active Italian immigrant community where feelings about the fascist regime back home ran in every direction. He argued about it openly, sometimes with other Italian families in town. And not long after that threat from the insurance man, another family member noticed a car parked near the house, a man sitting inside just watching the younger Sauter children as they walked home from school. Nobody called the police about any of it. None of it seemed at the time like more than strange coincidence. Then came the phone call at midnight. The lights left on downstairs, the unlocked door, the bang on the roof, and the rolling sound half an hour before the smoke started, and the fire which spread through the ground floor of that house. Living room, dining room, kitchen, George and Jenny's own bedroom, in what witnesses at the time estimated was as little as 45 minutes. So picture it again, now that you know all of this. A grieving mother standing in the ashes of her home on Christmas morning, being told her 5 children simply burned away to nothing. And somewhere underneath the grief, a question already starting to form that she will never fully let go of for the rest of her life. What if they didn't burn at all? Jenny Sauter could not accept the official explanation, and she set out to test it herself. In her own yard, she started burning animal bones, chicken bones, beef joints, pork chops, timing how long it took and how much survived. Every single time, she was left with a pile of charred but recognizable bone. Meanwhile, a man who worked at a local crematorium told her that a human body needs to burn for a full 2 hours at 2,000 degrees before the bones are gone completely. Her house, according to the fire department's own timeline, had burned for well under an hour. And yet household items down in that basement, pieces of appliances, small metal objects, had survived recognizably intact. If the fire wasn't hot enough to destroy a toaster, the family reasoned, how was it hot enough to erase 5 children without a trace? Then a telephone repairman came by to look at the line and told the family something that didn't fit the official story at all. The phone wire into the house looked cut, not burned, which raised an even bigger problem. If the fire really had started from faulty wiring, as the state inspector claimed, the electricity should have died with the wiring. The lights in the house should have gone dark. Instead, witnesses that night described the downstairs lights burning bright the entire time the fire raged. A witness came forward describing a man at the scene of the fire that same night, walking off with a block and tackle, the kind of tool used to hoist an engine out of a truck, the same trucks that had mysteriously refused to start. That man was eventually caught and pleaded guilty to stealing the equipment, though he denied any role in the fire itself. And not long after, the youngest surviving child, only 2 years old the night of the fire, found a hard rubber object out in the yard while the family was visiting the ruins. Jenny remembered the thud on the roof, the rolling sound. George became convinced it was a piece of incendiary ordnance, a napalm bomb of the kind used overseas during the war that had only just ended. The family wrote to the FBI. J. Edgar Hoover himself wrote back, saying the matter appeared to be local in nature and outside federal jurisdiction, though his agents would help if local police requested it. Fayetteville's police and fire departments never made that request. So the Sodders hired a private investigator instead, a man named C.C. Tinsley, and what he dug up only deepened the family's suspicion. The same insurance salesman who'd threatened George was sitting on the coroner's jury that ruled the fire accidental, and he'd previously worked for George and had quietly raised the coverage on the family's home insurance policy without their knowledge before the fire ever happened. Tinsley also uncovered a strange rumor about the fire chief. The same man who'd publicly said no remains were found had reportedly told someone privately that he actually had found something, a human organ, and had hidden it in a dynamite box buried at the scene. When the Sodders dug up that box and brought it to a funeral director, the verdict came back that it wasn't human tissue at all. It was beef liver, untouched by fire. Word later spread that the fire chief had buried it there himself, hoping any remains at all, real or not, would be enough to make the grieving family stop asking questions. In August of 1949, nearly 4 years after the fire, the Sodders arranged a full excavation of the basement, bringing in a Washington, D.C. pathologist to search the site properly. The dig turned up a handful of small damaged coins, a partially burned dictionary, and several fragments of human vertebrae. The bones were sent to the Smithsonian Institution for analysis, and the report that came back only complicated things further. The vertebrae, examiners found, belonged to someone between 16 and 22 years old at the time of death, older than any of the 5 missing Sodder children, the oldest of whom, Maurice, was 14. The report also noted something the family had suspected all along. There was no sign these bones had ever been exposed to fire at all, and given how thoroughly a real house fire should have burned, investigators would have expected to find far more than 4 isolated vertebrae. The most likely explanation, the Smithsonian concluded, was that the bones had simply come from the dirt George used to fill in the basement afterward. Dirt that could have come from almost anywhere. So 4 vertebrae that may not even belong to the family, and nothing else. No skulls, no other bones, nothing recognizable as 5 missing children, in a basement that had supposedly incinerated them completely. And then the sightings start. In the days and weeks after the fire, multiple people separately report seeing 5 dark-haired, dark-eyed children who matched the Sodder kids exactly. A woman running a tourist stop 50 miles northwest of Fayetteville says she served breakfast to children matching that description the very morning after the fire, and that a car with Florida plates was parked outside at the same time. A hotel employee in Charleston says she saw 4 of the 5 about a week later, traveling with 2 women and 2 men, all of apparent Italian heritage, who reacted with open hostility when she tried to speak to the children directly and switched to rapid Italian the moment she got close. A woman in St. Louis writes to say the eldest girl is living in a convent there. A tip surfaces from Texas, another from Florida. George Sodder chases every single one of them personally, driving across the country, and comes home every time with nothing. State hearings are eventually held in Charleston to review the case, and officials tell the Sodders their search is hopeless and that the file is closed. The family refuses to accept it. They put up that billboard along Route 16, 5 faces staring out over the highway, and they keep it there for the next several decades, adding a reward that eventually climbs to $10,000. Then, in the late 1960s, more than 20 years after the fire, an envelope arrives at the Sodder house, postmarked Kentucky. Inside is a photograph of a man in his mid-20s. On the back, in handwriting no one recognizes, a note, Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, Elil boys. Louis had been 9 years old the night of the fire. Jenny and George look at that photograph and see unmistakably their son. The same dark curly hair, the same brown eyes, even the same distinctive upward tilt to the left eyebrow. Terrified that going public might put him in danger, they never release the name of the town on the postmark. They hire another private investigator and send him to Kentucky to follow the lead. He is never heard from again. George dies in 1969, 24 years after the fire, still believing his children were out there somewhere. Jenny lives another 20 years after that, wearing black every single day until her own death in 1989, tending flowers on the ground where the house used to stand, and keeping that billboard up until the very end. It comes down only after she's gone. So go back now to that Christmas Eve. The phone ringing at midnight for a stranger who didn't exist at that address. The unlocked door, the lights left burning. The bang on the roof, and the sound of something rolling into place. Half an hour before the smoke started climbing the stairs. A father standing in his own yard with no ladder, no working truck, and a frozen rain barrel, screaming for 5 children he could not reach. The official record still says it was an accident. Faulty wiring, a tragic Christmas fire, 5 children lost. But the family that lived through it spent the rest of their lives certain of something else entirely. That somebody wanted those children gone that night and set a fire loud enough and hot enough to make sure no one asked why. Whether that's true, no one left alive can say for certain. What's certain is that nobody has ever found a single bone, a single confirmed sighting, a single answer solid enough to close the door the way the state of West Virginia closed it back in 1945. Just a mother in black watering flowers over a basement, waiting for 5 faces on a highway billboard to finally come home. There's a hill outside Rio de Janeiro where, for one afternoon in 1966, 2 men lay down in the grass, put lead over their eyes, and never got up again. No wound, no struggle, no answer. Just a notebook with instructions written in code, like they were waiting for something to come and get them. 60 years later, nobody, not the police, not the scientists, not the families, can tell you what that something was. If you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, welcome to Jaja. Please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. It's the afternoon of August 20th, 1966, on a steep, overgrown hillside called Morro do Ventém, on the outskirts of Niterói, just across the bay from Rio de Janeiro. An 18-year-old is out flying a kite. The wind-up here is good, the kind that pulls the string taut and makes the string sing a little, and he's not thinking about much of anything except keeping the kite in the air. The hill is steep and wild, thick with weeds and loose rock, the kind of place people don't really go unless they're chasing a kite that's drifted too far. So that's what he's doing, chasing it, working his way up through the brush, eyes on the sky, when his foot catches on something that isn't a rock. He looks down. 2 men are lying side by side in the grass. Not sprawled, not thrown, lying there, neat, like they'd chosen the spot and stretched out on purpose. Both of them are dressed in suits. Actual suits, jackets, and slacks, the kind of clothes you'd wear to a wedding or a funeral, not a hike up a weed-choked hill in the Brazilian heat. Over their suits, waterproof raincoats. And over their eyes, this is the part that stops the boy cold, the part that will still be unexplained 60 years from now. Homemade masks, cut and folded out of sheets of lead. Fitted to the face like something between a blindfold and a welder's goggles, heavy enough that whoever made them had to work at it. The boy doesn't stay to look closer. He runs. By the time police and firefighters make it up the hill, and it takes them a while, because Ventém Hill is steep enough that grown men in boots are slipping on the climb. The bodies have clearly been there for days. 3 days, it will turn out, though nobody knows that yet. There's no blood pooled beneath them. No defensive wounds, no signs anyone fought back or fought at all. Next to the 2 men laid out almost carefully, an empty water bottle, a small paper packet holding 2 damp towels, and a little notebook, the kind you'd use to jot down a phone number or a grocery list. Except what's written inside reads less like a list and more like a countdown to something. Whatever it was, it happened up here on this hill, in full view of the city lights below, and not one person in Niterói saw it coming. Here's where it gets stranger than a body in the grass. Once investigators pull the notebook out and read it properly, they realize it isn't a suicide note, and it isn't a shopping list. It's a set of instructions. Written in Portuguese, translated later into English, it says, 16:30, be at the specified location. 18:30, ingest capsules. After the effect, protect metals. Wait for signal, mask, which raises about a dozen questions at once. A signal from who? Capsules of what? And why would 2 grown men, dressed for a formal occasion, climb alone to the top of an empty hill and follow those instructions to the letter? Because that's exactly what the timeline says happened. They arrived. They waited. Then, if the note is to be believed, they took something, put the masks on, and lay down to wait for whatever came next. Nothing came. Or if it did, it left no trace. Word spreads fast through Niterói and across the bay into Rio, and within days, the case has a name that will follow it for the rest of the century. O Mistério das Máscaras de Chumbo, the lead masks case. Reporters start digging into who these men were, and what they find only deepens it. because the two men on that hill weren't strangers, weren't drifters, weren't the kind of people this was supposed to happen to. Their names were Manuel Pereira da Cruz and Miguel Jose Viana, and they were electronics technicians. Manuel was 32, Miguel was 34. Neither one of them was from Niterói or from Rio at all. They'd come from Campos dos Goitacazes, a town roughly 150 miles northeast, where the two of them ran a small home-based television and radio repair shop. Ordinary work, the kind of trade where you fix what's broken and hand it back. Miguel had gone as far as taking a correspondence course in electronics all the way from a school in Los Angeles back in 1951, a serious commitment for a man in a small Brazilian town with no internet, no easy mail, nothing but ambition, and a stack of lessons that had to cross an ocean to reach him. To their neighbors, that's all they were. Two competent, quiet men who could fix your television when the picture went fuzzy. Miguel was married to a woman named Elza. Manuel was married, too, to a woman named Nellie. Nothing about either of them screamed mystery. But behind the repair shop, behind the marriages and the correspondence courses, both men shared something their neighbors mostly didn't know about, and it's the thread that pulls this whole story somewhere stranger than a robbery gone wrong. They were spiritualists. Not casually, seriously, the kind of belief that reorganizes how you spend your evenings and your money. Friends would later describe them as part of a small, informal group of what got called scientific spiritualists. People who believed that if you combined the right instruments with the right ritual, you could open a door, contact something, someone, a spirit, an intelligence, whatever was on the other side of that door, if a door even existed. And here's the thing about two men who spend their days literally repairing radios and televisions. They already believe, on some level, that you can build something to reach across distance and pull in a signal from somewhere you can't see. So maybe it isn't such a leap for them to start believing the same principle could work for something less earthly. Metal to catch a frequency. A body tuned right at the right hour in the right place. Think about what it actually means to spend your working life the way these two did. Every day, someone brings you a television that shows nothing but static, or a radio that pulls in noise instead of music, and you take it apart, and you find the one loose wire or burned out tube standing between silence and a clear signal, and you fix it. Do that for years in a small shop in a small town, and it's not hard to imagine the line blurring a little between fixing a machine's connection to the world and believing you could build a connection of your own. Miguel, especially, had chased that expertise further than most men in Campos dos Goitacazes ever would. Sending away for that Los Angeles correspondence course back in 1951, working through printed lessons that arrived by mail from another hemisphere, just to understand electricity a little better than the next repairman on the block. In the weeks before August 20th, Manuel and Miguel start behaving differently. Not wildly, nothing that makes their wives call a doctor, but there's a shift. More time spent on something private. More materials brought home. When investigators later search the men's houses, they find literature on spiritualism and psychic contact, along with scraps and offcuts of sheet lead. The same material the masks on the hill were built from. Whatever they were preparing for, they were preparing carefully, and they were preparing at home, in secret, for weeks. Then comes August 17th, 3 days before the boy and his kite. That morning, Manuel and Miguel tell their families they're heading out on a work trip. Miguel later reportedly says Sao Paulo, materials for the shop, nothing that raises an eyebrow. It's the kind of errand tradesmen run all the time. Except instead of Sao Paulo, the two men board a bus in the opposite direction, toward Rio. And by 2:30 that afternoon, they've arrived in Niterói, a city they have no professional reason to be in. They don't go to a supplier. They go shopping for something else entirely. First, a shop that sells waterproof coats, where they each buy one. The same coats that will end up on their bodies 3 days later. Then a bar, where they sit down and order water. Just water, nothing stronger. The waitress who serves them will later tell police that Miguel seems off, nervous. He keeps checking his watch again and again, like he's timing something, like there's a schedule only he can see. That's the last confirmed sighting of either man alive. From that bar, it's presumed, they walked straight toward Vintem Hill, and up into the version of this story we already know. So here's where it starts tipping from strange into unanswerable. Because once you line the notebook up against the men's own private obsession, Spiritualism, contact, metal as a kind of shield. A theory starts to take shape, and it's the one most investigators eventually land on as the most plausible. That Manuel and Miguel climbed that hill to attempt exactly what the note described: a ritual. Capsules swallowed at 1830 on schedule, the way Miguel had been checking his watch to make sure they hit. Then the masks, protect metals, wait for signal, worn not for disguise, but because the two men genuinely believed that whatever they were about to make contact with would arrive as blinding light, and the human eye needed shielding from it. If that's what happened, then what killed them wasn't foul play at all. It was themselves. 2 capsules, contents unknown, taken on a hillside with no one around to help if something went wrong. But here's the escalation, the part that keeps this case unsolved instead of just sad. Investigators never get the chance to confirm any of it, because by the time an autopsy is finally performed, weeks after the bodies are found, because the coroner's office in Rio is overwhelmed with other cases, the internal organs have decomposed too far for reliable toxicology. No test for poison, no test for drugs, no way to know if those capsules were sedatives, psychedelics, poison, or something else entirely. The one piece of physical evidence that could have closed this case rotted away before anyone thought to look at it in time. And the theories don't stop at ritual gone wrong. Locals on the hill that same week report an orange, almost bluish light hovering low over the summit the evening the men are believed to have died, described by different witnesses as an oval shape, a flash that lit the whole hillside. One person reports hearing an explosion. Whether those sightings are connected to Manuel and Miguel, or whether they're just Niterói's imagination, running ahead of a story that was already strange enough, nobody can say. Vintem Hill, it turns out, already had a small local reputation for UFO sightings before any of this happened, which is exactly the kind of detail that either explains everything or explains nothing, depending on who you ask. There's a colder theory, too. The two men left Campos dos Goitacazes with what witnesses describe as a significant amount of cash, money meant, supposedly, for work materials. That money is never found on their bodies, which opens the door to a much less mystical explanation. That somebody lured them up that hill under the promise of a ritual, took the cash, and staged the rest to look like something otherworldly, a robbery dressed up as a religious experiment. Except, if that's true, the killer left behind 2 full sets of expensive lead masks, work that would have taken real time and materials to build, purely for the sake of a costume nobody needed to see. It's a theory that explains the money and completely fails to explain the masks. Now picture that hillside again. The boy with the kite, working his way through the brush, foot catching on something in the grass. Except now you know what he's about to find isn't a crime scene in the way he'll assume it is when he runs for help. It's the endpoint of a ritual 2 ordinary radio repairmen built for themselves, alone, on a hill with a view of the whole bay. Men who spent their working lives tuning signals out of the air for other people, and who may have died trying to tune one in for themselves. The investigation that follows never gets its answer. Police interview the waitress, the shopkeepers, the men's wives, their friends in the spiritualist circle. They search both houses and find more lead-off cuts, more literature, nothing that amounts to a confession or a motive for murder. A friend of the two men eventually comes forward and confirms what the note and the materials already suggested, that this was, as far as anyone close to them knew, a deliberate, planned attempt at contact, not an ambush. But confirming the plan isn't the same as confirming what killed them. Simultaneous accidental overdose remains the leading theory to this day, but it's a theory built entirely on circumstance, because the one piece of evidence that could prove it was there poison. Was there a drug? Was there anything at all in those capsules? Disappeared into decomposition before anyone could check. Over the decades, the lead masks case has been picked apart by Brazilian journalists, foreign researchers, at least one skeptic podcast dedicated to walking through every rational explanation on offer, and at least one national television special that reopened the file for a new generation. One of the first reporters ever to climb that hill, a crime journalist named Mario Diaz, kept coming back to the case for the rest of his career. And decades later, in his own memoir, he floated a theory nobody had fully chased down at the time. That the two men might have been poisoned not by any capsule of their own making, but by cicuta, a common and lethal wild plant that could easily have been growing in the same brush the boy was walking through when he found them. No test was ever run to confirm or rule it out. By the time anyone thought to ask the question seriously, there was nothing left to test. The skeptical researchers who've revisited the file since tend to land in the same place as the police did back in 1966, that this was very likely two men following through on their own plan, right down to the timestamps in the notebook, and that whatever was in those capsules probably killed them faster and more completely than they expected. It's a mundane answer wearing a very strange costume. But mundane isn't the same as proven, and proven is the one thing this case has never had. The masks themselves survive, kept as evidence, two crude ovals of hammered lead that have outlasted every theory built to explain them. And that's really the shape of this one. Not a killer stalking a hillside. Not aliens, not spies, not even, probably, foul play at all. Just two men who believed, completely, that if you built the right instrument and stood in the right place at the right hour, something on the other side would answer. They didn't leave with the truth. They just left the door open. And 60 years later, it's still open, still unanswered, still just two lead masks lying in an evidence room, facing nothing.
At around 5:30 p.m. on the evening of August 12, 1944, a young American military pilot named Joe walked out of his quarters on his base in England where he was stationed. And as soon as he was outside, he lit a cigarette to calm his nerves, and as he smoked the cigarette, he began walking towards the huge hangar on the other side of the base where his plane was waiting for him. Joe had been preparing for this night for weeks. He and his co-pilot, a 35-year-old lieutenant who was nicknamed Bud, were about to step off on a top-secret military mission called Operation Aphrodite. And this mission was not only top secret, but it was so unbelievably dangerous that basically anybody who knew about it considered it a suicide mission. But Joe tried not to think about that as he walked towards the hangar. Instead, he tried to think about the reason he was here in the first place, the reason he had joined the military, and that was to defeat the Nazis. And what he and his co-pilot were about to do, Operation Aphrodite, was going to play a huge role in defeating the Nazis. So this was about 5 years into World War II, and at this point, the Nazis were actually losing. However, it was making them more dangerous, not less, because they were becoming very, very desperate. And so they were launching all these outrageous attacks, basically because they had nothing to lose. And one horrible thing the Nazis were doing at this time were dropping these things called vengeance weapons. Hitler called them vengeance weapons. They were basically these huge bombs that the Nazis would drop arbitrarily across the United Kingdom on major population centers. And by this point in the war, these vengeance weapons had killed over 5,000 civilians. And at this exact moment, like this night, as Joe was walking towards the hangar, the Nazis had a stash of vengeance weapons aimed directly at London. That was going to be their next target. And so the mission that Joe and his co-pilot Bud were going on, Operation Aphrodite, was going to be to go out and destroy those vengeance weapons to save London. And as nervous as Joe was about this mission, and he was really nervous, he was also very excited. He actually had volunteered for this mission when many other pilots had done everything they could to stay away from this mission. And on top of that, Joe actually had flown enough missions by this point in the war that he didn't need to fly any more. He could just go home. But instead, he volunteered for this mission. And a reason why Joe might have decided to do that has a lot to do with the family he was raised in. So Joe came from a family that was very successful and accomplished, and his father really pushed Joe and his younger brother to be the very best at whatever they were doing and to be very competitive with each other. And so while Joe and his younger brother did love each other, they also had a pretty intense rivalry. And for a while, Joe's father obviously favored Joe. I mean, Joe was the favorite child, and, his father would always say, Joe's going to be the president someday. He's so talented. But after the attack on Pearl Harbor that brought the United States into World War II, both Joe and his younger brother joined the military, and pretty early on in the war, Joe's younger brother got an award for heroism. He had basically saved his platoon of men, and he won all these awards, and he was all over the news. And pretty quickly after that, Joe felt like he fell out of favor with his dad, that his dad kind of looked at the younger brother as being the favorite child now. And so Joe really started to feel insecure and wanted to prove himself really to his dad. And so when Operation Aphrodite came up, Joe volunteered for it really because he wanted to be a hero. He wanted to show his dad that he too could do something huge and change the course of history. And he would change the course of history but not in the way he expected. And so Joe continued to smoke a cigarette and hustled across the base towards the hangar, and as he did, he found himself kind of speeding up, like he just wanted to get over there and get started. Joe's commanders had given him a special code he would call out over the radio if this mission was successful. It was spade flush. That's what he'd say over the radio. And so as Joe hustled towards the hangar, he imagined how incredible it was going to be to yell out spade flush over the radio. I mean, it was only like 30 minutes away from that moment. This was a short mission. And so finally, Joe reached the hangar and he looked up to the sky one more time to make sure the weather looked solid, because actually they had tried to launch Operation Aphrodite a couple of days earlier, but it had been canceled because of fog. But Joe looked around and the weather looked good, and so he knew it was going to be a go. So he flipped his cigarette butt and stepped into the hangar. Inside this hangar was this massive, big open space. And in the center of the hangar on the floor was this huge plane called a B-24 Liberator. This was, of course, Joe's plane for the night. And so Joe immediately began walking towards the plane to check it out. Now, this particular type of plane was the type of plane Joe had been flying for the past 3 years. I mean, he'd flown many combat missions in this type of aircraft, so he was very familiar with it. But this particular B-24 was unlike any of the other B-24s Joe had ever flown. In fact, this aircraft was so unique, it was unlike any aircraft that any pilot in the American military had ever flown. I mean, this was really a one of one. And so as Joe walked around the outside of this plane, he began to notice some of these unique modifications that the mechanics had made to this aircraft. The most noticeable modification was actually the cockpit. Now, normally the cockpit had all these windows basically all around it, so the pilot could look in any direction and see what was going on, but obviously they needed to be protected from the elements. But this B-24 had all the glass removed except for one pane of glass, basically right in front of where Joe would be staring, just like a single windshield. And so it's almost like it was a convertible aircraft where it was all open air in the cockpit. And the reason for this change is because Joe and his co-pilot, during the course of this top secret mission, Operation Aphrodite, they would have to jump out and parachute to the ground. And so by having this all open, it would allow them to do that much easier. And then another big modification to the B-24 is the guns that were normally located on the outside of the aircraft were gone, and they were replaced by broomsticks painted black to look like guns at a distance. But the visible changes to this particular B-24 were nothing compared to the massive changes that were hidden inside this aircraft. Because the top secret part of Operation Aphrodite was really this particular plane. The plane was not really a plane, it was more like a huge flying bomb. The military's mechanics basically hollowed out the entirety of this plane, removed everything inside of it that was not absolutely vital, and they replaced it with explosives. 10 tons of explosives. Like, this is an unbelievable amount of explosives. A few minutes later, at around 5:55 p.m., Joe and his co-pilot Bud, who by this point had come into the hangar, finished doing their exterior inspection of the aircraft, and then they climbed into the cockpit, with Joe taking a seat in the pilot's seat and Bud sitting in the co-pilot's seat. And even though the evening was cool, both men were visibly sweating. Once the pilots got the go-ahead to begin the mission, Joe fired the first engine and then turned to look at the ground crew all around them, and he noticed all of them looked really, really serious. I mean, they obviously knew how intensely dangerous this mission really was, and the fact was, the pilots might not make it home, and so they're looking up at these guys like, I'm sorry you have to do this. But Joe, he looked out at these people and he sensed that was going on, and so he made a big show to wave and smile at them, to show confidence, like he knew what he was going to do, he's going to be fine. But in reality, Joe really was terrified. By 5:59 p.m., Joe had all 4 propellers spinning on the aircraft, and so he released the brake and began taxiing out to the runway. And as they bumped along, Joe and Bud became really aware of just how heavy this aircraft was from all the explosives. I mean, every bump, this plane is lurching up and down and really creaking and making lots of noises. I mean, this was sketchy. Finally, Joe went full speed ahead, and he and Joe went tearing down the runway, and at some point the plane did get lift and it took off into the air. And then just up ahead of him were 6 other planes that had just taken off moments before, who were going to escort Joe and Bud to their target area. Once Joe got the plane to its cruising altitude, he and Bud kind of relaxed for a second and began preparing themselves for what was going to happen next. They had about 15 minutes of just kind of casual flying before the real work of this mission began. The vengeance weapons that Joe and Bud were going out to destroy as part of Operation Aphrodite were located about 120 miles south, just outside of this little town in the very northern tip of France. But destroying these weapons would not be as simple as just Joe and Bud flying over top and releasing all their explosives and flying back home, because the Nazis had buried these vengeance weapons deep inside the hills in this town in northern France. And so regular bombs wouldn't touch these vengeance weapons. They had to do it a different way. And the way they were going to do it was Joe and Bud were going to fly their plane directly into the hills. And the way they would do this is they would fly their plane as close to the target area as possible, at which point one of the other pilots that were in the escort planes would take remote control of the B-24 flying bomb. And then once they had remote control, Joe and Bud, who no longer needed to do anything, they would jump out and parachute to the ground, and then the pilot who was remotely flying this now vacant B-24 flying bomb, they would just set it on autopilot to crash into the hills. At around 6:15 p.m., just as the English Channel came into view, Joe toggled a switch on his control panel, and then after he did, he and Bud kind of held their breath for a second to see what would happen. And then a couple of seconds later, the plane kind of shuddered for a second and then leveled out. And then a call came over the radio from one of the pilots who were in the escort planes telling Joe and Bud that they had just successfully taken remote control of the B-24. So at this point, Joe and Bud are no longer flying the aircraft. They're just sitting inside of this flying bomb. Now, there were only two things left for Joe and Bud to do before they could bail out to safety. They would need to arm the plane, so basically arm the explosives and make them ready to detonate. And then after that was done, they would need to call out over the radio, "Spade flush," the code Joe was given, which would signal to everybody else that the plane was ready and Joe and Bud were jumping out. And so once Joe and Bud nodded to each other and kind of acknowledged that, okay, we're going to do the last bit of this mission, Joe turned around in his seat and he looked at this control panel that was right behind him, and on this panel was the arming switch. And so once Joe flipped this, he and Bud would have a very short window of time to safely escape the aircraft. And so it was kind of like, flip it, make the radio call, and get the heck out of there. But Joe and Bud had trained for this moment over and over and over again, so they were ready. And so eventually, Joe flipped the switch, grabbed his radio, and called out, "Spade flush." What Joe and Bud could not have known when the mechanics were making all these modifications to this B-24 was that one of the mechanics accidentally crossed some wires in putting in all these explosives. And so just seconds after Joe had armed the explosives, they detonated. They were not supposed to, but they did. And so Joe and Bud were killed basically a fraction of a second after calling out "Spade flush." But it would turn out the catastrophic failure of Operation Aphrodite had no impact on World War II. In fact, Operation Aphrodite should never have happened in the first place. It was totally unnecessary. What Joe and Bud and the rest of the American military didn't know at the time was 5 weeks earlier, the British Royal Air Force dropped a whole bunch of ground-penetrating bombs all across those hills in northern France, and they destroyed all of the vengeance weapons. So when Joe and Bud took off on this doomed mission, there was no threat to London. None. But that is not the big reveal in this story, because Operation Aphrodite changed the course of American history in a really specific and really enormous way. Because Joe, whose full name was Joseph P. Kennedy Jr., was a member of the very famous Kennedy family, a big-time political family in America. And at the time, the Kennedys were all saying Joseph is going to be the next president of the United States. And everybody believed it. He was going to be the guy. But then, of course, Operation Aphrodite changed all of that because Joseph was killed. And so the war would end about a year later, and when it did, Joseph's younger brother, John F. Kennedy, who won that award for heroism and got a Purple Heart early on in the war, and he kind of became a war hero, which prompted Joe to volunteer for Operation Aphrodite. Yeah, John would begin his unbelievable political rise. And by 1960, John F. Kennedy, JFK, would become the 35th president of the United States, even though he wasn't supposed to. He was the second choice. It should have been Joe. As I mentioned earlier, I am now going to go live on YouTube to discuss further our big announcement, our graphic novel. All you have to do to join this live event is click on the Live tab on my YouTube channel. During this event, I will cover a personal story from my time in the Navy. I'll also chat with a few special guests that help make this book a reality. I'll share some more exclusive details about this book, and I'll answer any questions you might have about this book. Okay, that's it. So head on over now to the live section of my YouTube channel, and we'll talk about the upcoming Mr. Ballen graphic novel.
A family buys a modest duplex in a quiet Pennsylvania coal town, hoping for nothing more than a fresh start after a flood destroyed their old home. What they get instead is 13 years of something that follows them from room to room, that survives exorcism after exorcism, and that, according to the family, the priests, and two of the country's most famous demonologists, eventually turns violent enough to leave physical marks on the people living there. This is one of the most documented, most publicized, and most disputed hauntings in American history. If you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, welcome to Jaja. Please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. It's a night in the mid-1980s in a modest duplex on a quiet residential street in northeastern Pennsylvania. The house is old, built back in 1896, with the kind of thick walls and creaky staircases you'd expect from a place that stood for nearly a century. Outside, the street is silent. No traffic, no wind, nothing. Inside the master bedroom, a woman wakes up in the dark. Not gradually, the way you'd wake from a dream, but all at once. The kind of waking where your whole body goes rigid before your mind even catches up. She can't move. Not her arms, not her legs, not even her head to turn and see who or what is standing at the foot of the bed. And there is something there. A shape, darker than the darkness around it. Humanoid but wrong somehow. Watching her the way you'd watch something you already own. Beside her, her husband doesn't stir. He's asleep, deeply and unnaturally so. The kind of sleep that doesn't respond to a shout or a shake, even if she could manage either. She is completely alone with it. She will later describe the paralysis as total. Total in a way that felt deliberate, like something had reached into her body and simply switched it off. And she will describe what happens next only in the barest of terms, because some things, even years later, she still can't fully put into words. By morning, there are marks on her arms, scratches. What look almost like bite marks, red and raised against her skin, in places she couldn't have reached or caused herself. This isn't the first strange night in this house. It won't be the last. And by the time this family is done trying to explain what's happening to them, they'll have brought in exorcists, television crews, and two of the most famous names in American paranormal investigation, and still walk away with more questions than answers. The house on this quiet street has been slowly falling apart in ways that don't quite make sense. A television set bursts into flame with no electrical fault ever found. A dark stain spreads across a carpet overnight, appearing from nowhere. Water pipes leak again and again, no matter how many times a plumber resolders every joint. Scratches, long, parallel gouges, the kind you'd expect from something with claws, start showing up on painted walls and bathroom fixtures, in a house with no pets capable of making them. At first, the family tries to explain it all away. Old houses settle, pipes fail, kids leave the TV on too long. But the explanations stop holding up as the disturbances grow more frequent and more aggressive. Foul smells roll through the rooms with no source. Smoke, and beneath it, something like rotten meat. Voices murmur from empty corners. Furniture shifts position when no one's looking. And more than once, from somewhere inside the walls, the family swears they hear something that sounds unmistakably like a pig grunting. They call a plumber. They call an electrician. Eventually, quietly, almost embarrassed to even say it out loud, they call a priest. This is the Smurl family. Jack and Janet Smurl and their 4 daughters, Dawn, Heather, and twins Shannon and Karen, of Chase Street in West Pittston, Pennsylvania. Jack's parents, John and Mary Smurl, live in the other half of the duplex, sharing a single wall with their son's family. And what happens on one side of that wall, it turns out, never seems to stay contained to just one side. The story of how the Smurls ended up in this house starts with a disaster that had nothing to do with anything supernatural. In June of 1972, Hurricane Agnes tore through northeastern Pennsylvania, dumping over a foot of rain across the Susquehanna River Valley in just 3 days. The river rose and swallowed entire neighborhoods, including the Smurls' previous home. Displaced and needing somewhere to start over, the family bought the Chase Street duplex in August of 1973 for $18,000. A modest, unremarkable double-block house with no known history of tragedy, crime, or anything remotely occult. Jack Smurl was a Navy veteran who'd trained as a neuropsychiatric technician before eventually becoming a production manager at the Tops Chewing Gum Company. Janet stayed home raising their daughters. They were, by every account, a close-knit, working-class Catholic family, the kind of family that went to Mass, kept the lawn trimmed, and had no interest whatsoever in becoming a national story. By 1974, less than a year after moving in, the disturbances had already begun. Small at first, easy to dismiss. But as the years passed through the mid to late 1970s, the incidents grew stranger and more frequent, until by 1977, the family was dealing with scratches, moving objects, and unexplained sounds on what felt like a weekly basis. The Smurls tried, for years, to get help through ordinary channels, and kept hitting dead ends. Janet believed at one point she'd found a sympathetic priest willing to help, a man she knew as Father O'Leary, only to later discover no such priest actually existed within the diocese. The Roman Catholic Diocese of Scranton, when formally approached, said they'd consult with outside experts but considered direct involvement unlikely. With the church reluctant to step in, the family turned to a name that, by the mid-1980s, was already famous in paranormal circles: Ed and Lorraine Warren, demonologists who had investigated cases across the country, including the Amityville house in New York. The Warrens visited the Smurl home in 1986, and after their initial walkthrough, Ed Warren stated flatly that the house was inhabited by 4 separate entities, 3 lesser spirits, and 1 powerful demon controlling the others. He described the family as being under what he called a full-scale visual attack, and made clear he believed the danger was escalating. To confront the stronger presence, the Warrens brought in Father Robert McKenna, a traditionalist priest who had performed dozens of exorcisms in the past. What followed was not one exorcism, but a series of them, and by every account from the family, each one only seemed to make things worse. This is where the case turns from unsettling to genuinely disturbing. According to the Smurls, Janet was sexually assaulted in her own bed by what she and the Warrens described as an incubus. The same shadowy, paralyzing presence from that first terrifying night now escalated into something violent. Jack made an equally disturbing claim of his own, that he had been assaulted by a shape-shifting entity, appearing sometimes as a young woman and sometimes as an old one, with red eyes, green-tinted gums, and scaled skin. Their twin daughter, Karen, fell suddenly and severely ill with an unexplained fever that nearly killed her. Her twin sister, Dawn, was reportedly nearly assaulted by the same presence that had targeted her parents. The family dog was allegedly hurled bodily into a wall. One of the daughters was said to have been pushed down a flight of stairs by unseen hands. Janet and her mother-in-law, Mary, both reportedly bore slash marks and bite wounds on their arms that appeared overnight, with no explanation either woman could give. Father McKenna's first exorcism, conducted in Latin, brought exactly 3 days of peace, and then the activity returned, worse than before. His second attempt, on April 5, 1986, reportedly ended with holy water flung back at the priest mid-air, burning his skin, while the walls oozed a foul-smelling, unidentifiable substance. During a third attempt that June, the disturbance seemed to reach past the house itself. The entire block lost power. Inside, mattresses were said to rise toward the ceiling, with the children still lying on them, the twins screaming, before dropping back down. Above Jack and Janet's own bed, witnesses described a black mass taking the shape of an enormous snake before dissolving into nothing. At one point, according to the family, the presence spoke directly through Janet, revealing details about Jack's 1983 brain surgery, a procedure to relieve fluid pressure, that only the family should have known, using it to mock him and suggest that everything happening in the house was really just a product of his own damaged mind. Ed Warren, who had by then investigated hundreds of cases across the country, said he'd rarely seen anything with this level of hostility. According to his framework, hauntings moved through stages: infestation first, then oppression, then possession, and finally, if left unchecked, death. By the time Father McKenna performed his second and third attempts at the rite, Warren believed the Smurl family had already crossed from the first stage into the second, and that every failed exorcism was, in a strange way, only proving how powerful whatever lived in that house actually was. He and Lorraine spent months returning to Chase Street, running audio equipment through the night, hoping to capture something on tape that could stand as physical proof once the cameras and reporters eventually arrived. Back on that night, we opened with the paralysis, the shape at the foot of the bed, the marks that appeared by morning. The Smurls and the Warrens would later place that exact incident within the same pattern of assault. Janet, alone and unable to move, targeted by the same incubus that had already been building toward violence for months. What had looked, in that first telling, like an isolated nightmare was, according to everyone involved, simply one more entry in an escalating years-long campaign against this one family. And it didn't stay contained to the house. The family reported the presence following them on camping trips in the nearby Pocono Mountains and harassing Jack even at work, far from Chase Street entirely. Moving, they came to believe, wouldn't solve anything, because whatever this was, it wasn't attached to the building. It was attached to them. By 1986, word had gotten out, and the Smurl case became a media sensation. Reporters from across the country descended on the quiet Chase Street neighborhood. Neighborhood kids lined up outside just to look at the house. The family gave interviews, appeared on television, and in November of 1986 signed a book deal with St. Martin's Press for a first-hand account titled The Haunted, co-written with the Warrens and journalist Robert Curran. That book deal became its own controversy. Critics pointed out that the timing, a major publishing contract arriving just as the story reached peak media saturation, looked less like a family desperate for help and more like an opportunity being cashed in. Skeptics from the scientific community, including researchers who visited the home directly, argued that the physical evidence never rose above what could be explained by old plumbing, structural settling, and the psychological effects of a stressed, financially strained household caught in an escalating media spotlight. A priest sent by the local diocese spent 2 nights inside the home and reported that nothing unusual happened at all during his stay. The Smurls always maintained they'd never wanted the fame and that all they had ever asked for was help. Investigators from outside the Warrens' circle scrutinized the case just as hard as believers embraced it. Scientific skeptics who visited the property pointed to mundane explanations for nearly every individual incident. A home built in 1896 would naturally develop plumbing failures and settling cracks. A family under sustained media pressure and financial strain would naturally show signs of stress that could be mistaken for something else. And a house with a shared wall between 2 households would naturally produce noises that traveled unpredictably from one side to the other. None of those explanations, on their own, accounted for everything the family described. But taken together, skeptics argued, they accounted for enough to make an unproven and unprovable case out of the rest. What made the Smurl case different from most, though, was how many separate parties actually witnessed something firsthand. It wasn't only the family making claims from inside a closed room. Neighbors reported hearing screams and seeing flickering lights in the windows from outside. A priest was reportedly injured by holy water thrown back at him. Reporters who visited the home during the media frenzy described disturbances they couldn't immediately explain, even while remaining skeptical of the larger demonic narrative. That combination of independent witnesses alongside a family telling an increasingly extreme story, wrapped in a lucrative book deal, is exactly what made the case so difficult to simply dismiss and so difficult to fully believe. In 1987, worn down, the family finally moved out of the Chase Street duplex. But according to their own account, the disturbances didn't end there. Smaller incidents were said to follow them into their new home, fading only after a final, quiet exorcism performed sometime in the early 1990s, one the family chose to keep almost entirely out of the press this time. The Smurl haunting never got the kind of clean ending most cases like this one crave. No definitive proof ever surfaced. No skeptic ever fully disproved it either. The Warrens stood by their findings until the ends of their own lives. Father McKenna, later elevated to bishop, never recanted what he witnessed inside that house. And the Smurls themselves spent the rest of their public lives insisting that everything they described, the voices, the assaults, the black shape over their bed, happened exactly as they said. The story didn't fade quietly. A television movie dramatized it in 1991. Nearly 4 decades later, it resurfaced again as inspiration for The Conjuring, Last Rites, bringing an entirely new generation face-to-face with the Smurls account. The house on Chase Street is still standing today, An ordinary looking duplex on an ordinary Pennsylvania street, the kind of place you could drive past 100 times without a second glance. Somebody lives there now. And whatever did or didn't happen inside those walls between 1974 and 1989, one detail keeps pulling people back to this story, decade after decade. According to the family who lived it, moving away was never actually the escape they thought it would be. Whatever followed them out the front door in 1987 followed them because, in the end, it was never really about the house at all.